Ahmed al Shara went to the Israeli border alone, despite his advisors' objections. His conversation with the Israeli soldiers there was so effective that some soldiers couldn't hold back their tears. The leaked audio recording of the conversation opened a new page in Israel-Syria relations. The pre-dawn darkness enveloped the Syrian presidential palace in Damascus as Ahmed al Shara quietly slipped out of his private quarters. For the past 3 weeks, an idea had been growing in his mind, one so audacious that he knew his security team and advisors would never approve. Today, he would make a journey that could either spark a new era of peace or trigger an international crisis. In the palace's secure briefing room, his chief of staff, Omar al-Mahmoud, was preparing the morning security report when he discovered the president's empty office. "Where is he?" Omar demanded from the night security detail. "Sir, the president said he was going for an early morning walk in the palace gardens," replied Captain Khalil, uncertainty creeping into his voice. But Ahmed al Shara was already 20 kilometers away, driving a nondescript civilian car toward the Golan Heights. He had planned this carefully, choosing a route that avoided main checkpoints, timing his departure when security protocols were at their most relaxed. His destination, the border fence that had separated Syria and Israel for over 5 decades. The Golan Heights stretched before him as the sun began to rise, casting long shadows across the disputed territory. This land had been the source of 3 wars, countless skirmishes and generations of hatred. But today, al-Shara saw it differently. He saw an opportunity. At the Quneitra crossing point, Israeli defense forces maintained their usual vigilant watch. Lieutenant David Cohen, a 23-year-old from Tel Aviv, was beginning his morning patrol when he noticed something unusual through his binoculars. A man in civilian clothes was walking directly toward the border fence from the Syrian side. "Command, we have movement on the Syrian side. Single individual approaching the perimeter," Cohen radioed to his base. The response was immediate. "Maintain position. Do not engage unless there's a direct threat. We're sending backup." As al-Shara approached the fence, he could see the Israeli soldiers clearly. Their weapons were ready, but their posture suggested confusion rather than aggression. This wasn't the typical pattern of border incidents they were trained for. Al-Shara stopped exactly 10 meters from the fence line, close enough to speak, far enough to avoid triggering defensive protocols. He raised his hands slowly, showing he was unarmed, and called out in clear Arabic, knowing the Israeli soldiers would have Arabic speakers among them. "I am Ahmed al Shara, and I come in peace." The effect was electric. Lieutenant Cohen's eyes widened as he recognized the name and face that had dominated international news for months. Through his radio, urgent calls were being made to higher command. This was no ordinary border incident. "Sir," Cohen called out, his voice steady despite the unprecedented situation, "you are at the Israeli border. Please state your intentions." Al-Shara's response would later be described by witnesses as one of the most extraordinary moments in modern Middle Eastern diplomacy. "Lieutenant," he said, his voice carrying across the fence line with surprising clarity, "I have come to speak not to your government, but to you, soldiers who serve their country just as our soldiers serve ours." By now, additional Israeli forces had arrived. Captain Sarah Rosen, the area commander, took position beside Cohen. Her radio crackled with instructions from Tel Aviv. "Maintain observation, record everything, avoid escalation." "You know who I am," al-Shara continued, his gaze moving from soldier to soldier. "You have been told I am your enemy. Your media calls me a terrorist. Your leaders say I threaten Israel's security. But I stand before you today not as an enemy, but as a neighbor who is tired of war." The silence that followed was profound. Even the morning birds seemed to pause their songs. "I was born in 1982, al Shara said, his voice taking on a more personal tone. "Do you know what that means? It means I have never known a day of peace between our peoples. Neither have you, young lieutenant. Your parents knew war with Syria. Your grandparents knew war with Syria. When will it end?" Lieutenant Cohen found himself unable to look away. This was not the scenario covered in any military training. Captain Rosen was equally transfixed, her hand moving unconsciously to her radio but not yet calling for instructions. "I have seen what war does," al Shara continued. "I have seen Syrian children who will never walk again because of bombs. I have seen mothers weep over graves that should never have been dug. But I have also seen something else. I have seen that the children who suffer look the same, whether they are Syrian or Israeli." In Tel Aviv, the situation was escalating rapidly through the chain of command. Defense Minister Yoav Gallant was being briefed as he entered his office. "Sir, we have an unprecedented situation at the Golan border. The Syrian leader is there personally, speaking directly to our soldiers." "Is he armed? Is this some kind of provocation?" Gallant demanded. "No, sir. He appears to be unarmed and is speaking about peace." Prime Minister Netanyahu was awakened with the news. His first instinct was to order al Shara's immediate removal from the border area, but his security advisor counseled patience. "Sir, the entire incident is being recorded. Any aggressive action could have significant international ramifications." Back at the fence, al Shara was reaching the emotional core of his message. "You wear the uniform of the Israeli Defense Forces. I once wore the uniform of those who fought against you. But today I stand here not in uniform, but as a man who dreams of the day when our children will not need to wear uniforms at all." Captain Rosen felt something she had not expected, tears welling in her eyes. Lieutenant Cohen's hand, which had been resting on his weapon, slowly moved away. "Lieutenant," al Shara addressed Cohen directly, "what is your name?" The young soldier hesitated, looking to his captain for guidance. Rosen nodded slightly. "David," Cohen replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "David," al Shara repeated, "a good name, a name that connects us to this ancient land we both love. David, I want you to know that when I return to Damascus today, I will tell my people about the young Israeli soldier named David, who listened when an old enemy came to speak of peace." The moment was interrupted by the arrival of additional vehicles on both sides of the border. Syrian military units, having discovered their president's location, were racing to the scene. Israeli reinforcements were also en route. Al Shara noticed the approaching vehicles and knew his time was limited. "I must go soon," he said, "but before I do, I want to say something that your leaders and mine may not want to hear." He paused, ensuring he had everyone's attention. "The Golan Heights," he said, looking directly at the disputed land around them, "has been a source of war for too long. Maybe it is time for it to become a source of peace. Not through conquest, not through surrender, but through understanding that we are all children of Abraham, whether Muslim, Jewish, or Christian." The approaching Syrian vehicles were now visible to the Israeli soldiers. Protocol demanded that they prepare for a potential confrontation, but something extraordinary was happening. Neither side was raising weapons. Both groups seemed transfixed by the historic moment unfolding. "David," al Shara called out one final time, "someday when this fence is no longer a barrier but just a line on a map, I hope you will visit Damascus, and I hope I will visit Jerusalem, not as enemies planning war, but as neighbors building peace." With that, Ahmed al Shara turned and walked back toward the approaching Syrian vehicles. But as he reached his security team, he did something that would be talked about for decades. He turned back toward the Israeli soldiers and placed his hand over his heart, in a traditional Middle Eastern gesture of respect and sincerity. Lieutenant Cohen, without thinking, found himself returning the gesture. Captain Rosen noticed and, after a moment's hesitation, did the same. Soon, a dozen Israeli soldiers stood at the border fence, hands over hearts, acknowledging a moment of shared humanity with a man they had been trained to see as an enemy. The drive back to Damascus was tense. Omar al-Mahmoud, who had arrived with the security team, was furious. "Mr. President, what you did was incredibly dangerous. You could have triggered an international incident. You could have been killed." Al Shara listened quietly, then responded with characteristic calm. "Omar, my friend, sometimes the greatest risk is in not taking risks. Sometimes peace requires someone to take the first step, even when that step feels impossible." Unknown to anyone at the time, the entire encounter had been captured by multiple recording devices. Israeli border surveillance had automatically recorded everything. A Syrian journalist who had been following a hunch about the president's unusual morning absence had managed to capture audio from a distance. The recording would not surface immediately. For 3 days, both governments maintained official silence about the incident. Israeli officials were divided, some seeing it as a propaganda stunt, others recognizing an unprecedented peace overture. Syrian officials were equally uncertain about how to respond to their president's unilateral diplomatic initiative. But secrets of such magnitude rarely stay hidden. On the 4th day, portions of the audio recording were leaked to international media. The excerpt that played repeatedly on news stations worldwide was al Shara's direct address to Lieutenant Cohen. "David, I want you to know that when I return to Damascus today, I will tell my people about the young Israeli soldier named David, who listened when an old enemy came to speak of peace." The international reaction was immediate and intense. The United States State Department issued a carefully worded statement acknowledging interesting developments in the region. The European Union called for constructive dialogue based on the encouraging signals from Syria's leadership. But the most significant reaction came from an unexpected source. Lieutenant David Cohen, the young Israeli soldier who had been personally addressed by al Shara, requested permission to make a public statement. Standing before Israeli military reporters, Cohen said, "When someone crosses enemy lines not to attack, but to talk about peace, when someone looks you in the eye and speaks about children and hope instead of war and hatred, you have to listen." I listened, and I heard something that changed how I think about our neighbors. The statement sent shockwaves through Israeli society. Within hours, it had been translated into Arabic and was being shared across Syrian social media. Young Syrians began posting messages of support for the young Israeli soldier who listened. Prime Minister Netanyahu found himself in an impossible position. Hardliners in his government demanded that he condemn al Shara's border crossing as a violation of sovereignty. But public opinion, particularly among younger Israelis, was shifting. Polls showed that 60% of Israelis under 30 wanted their government to explore the peace message from Syria's leader. 3 weeks after the border incident, Netanyahu made an announcement that surprised the world. Israel would be willing to engage in preliminary, unofficial discussions about normalizing relations with Syria, provided certain security guarantees were met. The announcement came during a cabinet meeting that had been scheduled to discuss routine matters. But as Netanyahu spoke about the evolving situation with Syria, it became clear that al Shara's border visit had fundamentally altered the political calculus. "The young man who crossed the border," Netanyahu said, referring to al Shara without naming him directly, spoke about children and peace. "As leaders, we have a responsibility to our children to explore every avenue toward peace, even when that avenue appears unexpectedly." In Damascus, al Shara received the news while meeting with his Reconstruction Planning Committee. His response was characteristically measured. Peace is not built in a day, but it begins with a single conversation. I am grateful that the conversation has begun. 6 months later, the first formal meeting between Israeli and Syrian officials in over 2 decades took place in Geneva. The talks were facilitated by Switzerland and attended by representatives from the United States, Russia, and the European Union. The breakthrough came when both delegations agreed to establish a joint committee to address the humanitarian needs of civilians affected by decades of conflict. It was a small step, but it was progress. A year after his border visit, al Shara was invited to address the United Nations General Assembly. In his speech, he reflected on the power of direct human communication. Sometimes the most important diplomacy happens not in marble halls or conference rooms, but at a border fence between 2 young men who chose to listen instead of shoot. In the audience, David Cohen sat as a guest of the Israeli delegation. He had been promoted to captain and was now serving as a liaison officer for border security cooperation, a position that hadn't existed before al Shara's visit. After the speech, Cohen approached al Shara in the corridor outside the assembly hall. "Mr. President," he said, "thank you for teaching me that enemies can become neighbors." Al Shara smiled, placing a hand on the young officer's shoulder. "Captain David, thank you for proving that when we speak from the heart, people listen with the heart." The exchange was photographed by UN media and became one of the most widely shared images of the year. It showed 2 men from nations that had been enemies for generations, standing together in friendship. Not everyone supported the developing relationship between Syria and Israel. Extremists on both sides denounced the peace efforts, but the momentum that had begun with a single conversation at a border fence proved stronger than the forces of division. 2 years after al Shara's historic border visit, the first commercial flight in decades departed Damascus for Tel Aviv. On board were Syrian business people, academics, and ordinary citizens, eager to see a land that had been forbidden to them their entire lives. Among the passengers was an elderly Syrian woman named Fatima, who carried with her a letter written by her grandfather to his Jewish neighbors in Damascus before they fled in 1948. She hoped to find their descendants in Israel and deliver the letter, a message of forgiveness that had waited 75 years to be heard. Her story became a symbol of how al Shara's moment of courage at the border fence had opened possibilities that once seemed impossible. The letter she carried read simply, "To my neighbors who had to leave, the door to our home and our hearts has always remained open. We pray for the day when you can return not as strangers, but as friends." As the plane flew over the Golan Heights, passengers on both sides of the ancient divide looked down at the land that had once been a battlefield and now, slowly, was becoming a bridge. And somewhere below, at a border fence that still stood but no longer seemed insurmountable, the ghost of a conversation continued to echo. A conversation that had proven that even the most entrenched conflicts could be transformed by the simple act of one person choosing to see enemies as human beings. Ahmed al Shara's journey to the border had lasted only a few hours, but the journey toward peace that it began would continue for generations. And it all started with a young man named David who chose to listen when an old enemy came to speak of hope.